Hi. In this presentation, I will first summarize Chapter 4 from the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. Then we'll move to the book chapter titled Naming a Critical Communication Pedagogy from the Critical Communication Pedagogy by Diana Fassett and John Warren. While in Chapter 3 we read about a critical framework for educators, in Chapter 4, Freire talks about the framework for revolutionaries that establishes ways to interact with people embedded within oppressive structures. In the thesis on page 125, Freire talks about the theories of cultural action, which is how people create transformative changes in their culture and society at large. He states that the theories of cultural action is rooted in two kinds of social action or human action. One is the anti-dialogical action embedded in praxis of domination, and the second way by which a transformative change takes place is through a dialogical action rooted in dialogue. Dialogue marked by an epistemological relationship between the leader and the followers. It is a continuous process and not merely a tool or a technique. He adds that the revolutionary efforts to transform structures cannot designate the leader or the dominant elites as thinkers and the non-elites or the oppressed as doers. The leaders can act as facilitators or coordinators but cannot impose their words on others, cannot treat the others as their possessions. And this is on page 126. Freire then talks about the characteristic features of an anti-dialogical and dialogical social actions, which is what I'm going to cover in the next few slides. The features that characterizes anti-dialogical actions include conquest, divide and rule, manipulation, and cultural invasion. The first characteristic feature of an anti-dialogical action is conquest, in which the goal of the oppressive leader is to conquer or persuade the other. Freire argues how the dominant elite within a culture deposits myths in order to preserve the status quo of power and control. For example, on page 140, we read the myth of the oppressed being lazy. Another fundamental dimension of the anti-dialogical action is divide and rule, because unity means a threat to the leader's hegemony. Freire describes how the dominant elites use various strategies such as leadership training courses to prevent the people from organizing on their own and only focus on developing specific individuals as leaders within the community. This is on page 143. On page 148, we read about the next dimension of an anti-dialogical action, which is manipulation, in which the leaders try to conform the masses to the objectives that the leaders have set for the oppressed, leading to an unauthentic type of organization. With respect to cultural invasion, Freire claims cultural invasion is always an act of violence against the persons of the invaded culture who either loses their originality or face the threat of losing it. Something Freire notes is how the invaded view the invaders as being superior and willing to walk like them, dress like them, talk like them. And the reclamation from this cultural invasion requires revolutionary leaders to reach everyone and not just a few. And this is on page 153. Moving on to the dialogical theory of action. The first characteristic feature is cooperation, which is in opposition to conquest that I touched upon in the previous slide. And in what follows, you will see a dualism between divide and rule and unity, manipulation and organization, and cultural invasion and cultural synthesis. Cooperation is when the social I meets in cooperation and builds a relationship with the social thou to transform reality. And this is on page 167, where the author cites Martin Buber. On page 172, the author talks about unity for liberation. In the dialogical theory, both the revolutionary leaders and followers must unite and work together in carrying out a liberating praxis. Talking about organization on page 175, the author mentions that organization is the opposite of manipulation and is also a natural result of unity. While unifying the oppressed, the revolutionary leaders are also trying to organize them to view liberation as a common goal. On page 180, the author states that in cultural synthesis, it is possible to resolve the contradictions between different worldviews of the leaders and that of the people to the enrichment of both. Cultural synthesis does not deny the differences between the two worldviews. It is based on these differences. However, it does deny the invasion of one by the other, but affirms the undeniable support each gives to the other. And this is on page 181. So this is how Freire describes how revolutionary leaders can put their pedagogy into action to work with the oppressed for liberation. So in our next slide, I will talk about the thematic conceptualization of Facet and Warren's 10 commitments of critical communication pedagogy. In this autoethnographic work, the authors articulate the commitments underpinning the critical communication pedagogy. The thesis of this chapter is on page 38, where it says that a critical educator should work making the classroom as a site of social influence with commitments that call for a different kind of and language for action. And there are 10 commitments, and I'll talk about those in the next slides. And these commitments highlight what separates critical communication pedagogy from the other scholarly areas of inquiry. The critical turn in communication and instruction is characterized by 10 commitments of critical communication pedagogy. Between pages 39 and 41, we read about the first commitment, which states that identity is produced communicatively, which is in opposition to the assumption that identity is given and is simply enacted. There are two theoretical perspectives that illuminate this commitment. One is power and culture, which looks at how certain markers of identity can create a discriminatory environment within the classroom. For example, categorizing some students as at risk while a certain section is not. The second theoretical perspective outlines how identity is performatively accomplished. For example, how do we make mundane choices and how we talk about identities shape how we understand those identities? And this is on page 40. On page 41, the author talks about power being fluid and complex. A teacher can use this tool of power wisely or poorly to enable students. On page 42, we read that culture is central to critical communication pedagogy in order to understand how student behavior is embedded in and shaped by different lived experiences. On page 43, we read about the fourth commitment, which is embracing the concrete and mundane communication practices as constitutive of larger social structures, because in those mundane moments, social structures emerge. The fifth commitment talks about the critical educator embracing the social structural critique as it places concrete mundane communication practices such as grades, research methods in a meaningful context. For example, autoethnographic work is contextually located and cannot meet the criteria of generalizability to a larger audience. And this is on page 48. On page 48, the authors mention about the next commitment, which is the usage of language. It is important to understand how languages are used in order to make possible new understandings of experience. For example, students using language to name their own experience rather than the teacher labeling it as communication needs of at-risk student. This is on page 49. On page 50, we read about the practice of reflexivity as a commitment that interrogates the self or the situatedness of the teacher or researcher in teaching or research space to construct meanings together with students or research participants. On page 51, the author talks about the next commitment, which is praxis, and refers to Freire's definition of praxis, which is reflecting and acting together in a collaborative space. And flowing from this commitment of praxis is the next commitment of critical educators being co-investigators in research and teachings. Freire tells us that critical communication pedagogy goes beyond the language of deconstruction and critique. It creates a language of change, hope, growth, community, and a collaborative reflection to understand our world. This is on page 54. The last commitment is dialogue. As a process of inquiry, we undertake dialogue together for the process of deconstructing ideologies, identities, and culture. The authors also add that dialogue cannot exist without humility. This is on page 55. That's all I have for these two readings. I will post the questions shortly, and thank you for listening. I hope to see you all. Thank you.